August 7, 1944. The rolling fields of Normandy were still scarred by weeks of shell fire and tank battles. The air smelled of burnt fuel and wet earth. German soldiers retreating through narrow roads expected the usual threats: Allied bombers overhead in tight formations, or fast-flying fighters meant only to escort them. What they did not expect was to sight an American fighter, the stubby, barrel-chested Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, swooping down almost like a hawk, carrying beneath its wings a bomb load nearly half the size of what a 4-engine B-17 flying fortress usually hauled across Europe. For men who had dismissed this American machine as an overweight curiosity, the shock was almost too much to process. The Luftwaffe had spent years training itself to fear heavy bombers, not single-engine fighters. The doctrine was simple: destroy the fortresses and liberators before they unloaded their devastating cargo on factories and cities. Fighters, at least in their minds, were little more than gnats, dangerous in a duel, yes, but incapable of carrying the war's true destructive weight. By 1943 and early 1944, German pilots referred to the P-47 in mocking tones, calling it a flying milk bottle or the jug. It was slow compared to the lithe Messerschmitt 109 and thicker than the sleek Focke-Wulf 190. To them, it seemed almost comical, an American brute force design with wings too broad and a body too heavy for finesse. But as the Allied invasion of France unfolded, the Thunderbolt was undergoing a transformation that few had predicted. What began as an escort fighter was rapidly being reforged into one of the deadliest ground attack aircraft of the war. Its airframe was rugged enough to survive punishment that would shred lighter fighters. Its engine, the monstrous Pratt & Whitney R 2800 Double Wasp, gave it not only speed but the raw strength to lift extraordinary weight. And in that strength lay the Allies' secret weapon: bombs. At first, even American crews laughed at the idea. Fighters carried bombs? That was the job of a B-17, or at least a twin-engine Marauder. But experiment after experiment proved the Thunderbolt's toughness. By mid-1944, a single P-47 could haul as much as 2,500 pounds of bombs, one 1,000-pound bomb under the fuselage, and another 1,000 pounds split across its wings, with rockets slung on as well for good measure. That meant a dozen Thunderbolts could strike with nearly the same force as half a squadron of flying fortresses, but with none of the slow formation flying, none of the vulnerability to mass flak at high altitude. Instead, they came low, fast, and surgical, choosing bridges, tanks, and rail yards that no heavy bomber could strike with precision. For the German soldier in the field, it was a nightmare. They had braced themselves for the drone of heavy bombers miles overhead, where anti-aircraft guns at least had a chance. But there was little to prepare them for the scream of a Thunderbolt diving almost vertically toward a convoy, the whistle of bombs released at treetop height, and the roar of an engine pulling out only meters above the ground. The Luftwaffe had no real answer to this. Fighters that once sought noble duels in the sky now found themselves strafing locomotives and pounding tanks into twisted wreckage. Cold numbers tell part of the story. A B-17 Flying Fortress typically carried around 4,800 to 5,000 pounds of bombs on deep missions into Germany. But when range was extended, loads dropped sometimes to 3,000 pounds. Now compare this to a Thunderbolt, carrying 2,500 pounds while still being able to climb, fight, and escape in ways a bomber never could. And unlike the lumbering B-17s, Thunderbolts flew in dozens or hundreds per mission, spreading destruction over entire landscapes rather than a single industrial city. One American pilot, Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, remembered it vividly. "We called her a bulldog with wings. She carried bombs like a truck, rockets like a battleship, and still fought like a fighter." He wasn't exaggerating. Reports from a 9 Tactical Air Command noted Thunderbolt squadrons knocking out tanks and bridges at a rate that surprised even Eisenhower's headquarters. A German officer's diary, captured after the Battle of Normandy, recorded his disbelief. "We thought them only escorts. Now they fall upon us as bombers, swift and merciless." And indeed, swiftness was a key. Heavy bombers took hours to climb, form up, and lumber across Europe. Thunderbolts could be over a target in minutes, often appearing out of low cloud banks with no warning. Villagers in France would later recall the ground trembling beneath their feet as flights of Thunderbolts streaked overhead, their bombs slamming into railway lines or armored columns. It was as if the sky itself was throwing iron, one farmer remembered. It wasn't just about raw firepower. It was about psychological shock. German tank crews, once so confident in their armor, began to dread the howl of diving fighters. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns chewed through softer vehicles, while rockets and bombs ripped apart Panthers and Tigers. Even the Luftwaffe's own pilots began to admit that their once mocked enemy had become the most dangerous predator over the battlefield. One recalled bitterly, "We used to laugh at their thickness. Now when we see them, it is we who feel thin." Yet in the midst of all this grimness, irony found its place. The Allies themselves leaned into the joke. The jug, they said, was like a flying beer mug, stout, heavy, and overflowing. But unlike a mug, when this one was filled, it spilled not wine but high explosives. A pilot joked after returning from a sortie, "She may be fat, but she makes one hell of a delivery girl." Laughter in the mess hall sometimes masked the tension of combat, but also revealed how extraordinary this shift had been. In tactical terms, the impact was transformative. German supply lines, already strained by the Allied advance, became nearly impossible to maintain. A convoy that might once have risked a bomber raid could now be annihilated in minutes by a handful of fighters. Bridges were destroyed faster than engineers could repair them. Rail yards were cratered into uselessness. In 1 week of August, 9 tactical Air Force Thunderbolts flew over 2,000 sorties, delivering more explosives than many bomber groups did in the same period. For civilians under occupation, the sight was both terrifying and liberating. French villagers recalled cheering as P-47s obliterated German trucks in broad daylight. The destruction was horrific, but it was also a sign the Allies were winning the skies not only with their fortresses, but with their unlikely workhorse. The Luftwaffe's morale suffered accordingly. Pilots who had once believed in clean duels between Messerschmitts and Mustangs now saw their airfield strafed, their tanks bombed, their retreating convoys turned into twisted wreckage. A German general, captured after the war, summed it up grimly. The hunter had become the bomber. We had no defense against such a transformation. By the time the Allies encircled the Falaise pocket in late August 1944, the Thunderbolt had proven its worth beyond any doubt. German columns trying desperately to escape the trap were pounded day and night. Pilots later said the roads looked like slaughter alleys, lined with burned vehicles and shattered armor. Farmers returning after the war recalled the ground glittering with shrapnel for years. And above it all, the memory remained. The ungainly, overweight jug had brought destruction in ways the Luftwaffe had never thought possible. But as devastating as this seemed, it was only the beginning. The P-47 was not yet finished reinventing itself. If the Germans thought Normandy was the peak of its destructive power, they would soon be proven wrong. Because what came next, as autumn fell over Europe, shocked them even more. Autumn 1944. The leaves in the Ardennes were beginning to turn, and the air carried the chill of another winter that Europe dreaded. On paper, the German High Command still told itself that the Allied fighters were merely escorts, a nuisance men to guard the great bombers that threatened German cities. They still believed that true destruction came from mass formations of flying fortresses, not from the stubby, broad-winged American P-47 Thunderbolt. It was easier to cling to that belief than to accept the growing evidence that one fighter, built like a blacksmith's hammer, was rewriting the very definition of air power. For the Luftwaffe, the surprises never stopped coming. Trains that once ran at night to avoid Allied bombers were now hunted in daylight by Thunderbolts diving from low clouds. Armored columns thought safe on forest roads were suddenly engulfed in fire, struck by bombs and rockets that came from fighters barely large enough to carry a pilot. The once scorned jug was no longer an escort. It was a one-man bomber, faster, tougher, and far more unpredictable than anything German commanders had prepared for. The scale of it all was staggering. In the weeks after Normandy, U.S. Tactical Air Commands unleashed wave after wave of Thunderbolts. Each one could carry 2,000 to 2,500 pounds of bombs, plus rockets and the punishing bite of 8.50 caliber machine guns. Multiply that by squadrons flying 2 or 3 sorties per day, and the arithmetic became terrifying. A, B. 17 formation might pound a factory once in 24 hours. Thunderbolts could devastate 3 bridges, a convoy, and a rail yard before dusk. Eisenhower himself later admitted that tactical air power, the fighters that became bombers, was the greatest single contribution to victory on the ground. Cold statistics tell the story, but they only hint at the reality. Between June and December 1944, Thunderbolts were credited with destroying more than 86,000 German rail cars, 9,000 locomotives, and nearly 6,000 armored vehicles. Those were not abstract numbers. They were the lifelines of an army that lived on steel and gasoline. Cut off the trains, and tanks became stranded hulks. Destroy the fuel convoys, and divisions froze in place. Every German soldier who marched into battle felt the absence. No shells for artillery, no fuel for engines, no food for the hungry. The Luftwaffe had gambled on defending against bombers from high above, but now death arrived at treetop height, sudden and merciless. The testimonies of those who lived through it bring the numbers alive. A French villager remembered watching from his barn as a flight of thunderbolts struck a German bridge across the Seine. The whole earth seemed to leap. The water exploded upward as if the river itself had burst in rage. German tank crews later recalled the horror of hearing the roar of radial engines overhead, followed by the shriek of rockets. One officer described it in his diary. It was as if iron itself had learned to scream. To the men on the ground, these were not just machines. They were predators relentless and precise. The Germans tried to adapt. Camouflage was improved. Convoys moved at night. Roads were hidden under tree canopies. But Thunderbolt pilots learned to hunt by sound, by shadow, by the gleam of sunlight on metal. Pilots joked that the Jug was so tough you could strap a barn door under its belly, and it would still fly. The humor disguised a brutal truth. The P-47 was practically indestructible compared to German fighters. Many returned with holes in the fuselage large enough to crawl through, but still landed safely. One American pilot quipped after limping home with his aircraft shredded by flak, "She flies like a brick, but a brick that refuses to fall." There was irony in abundance. The Luftwaffe had once prided itself on being the terror of Europe. Sleek Messerschmitts cutting through the skies, elegant Stukas shrieking in their dives. Now, their armies were stalked by a fighter the Germans had dismissed as clumsy. The elegant duel had been replaced by a barroom brawl in the sky. As one German officer bitterly remarked, "Where once we feared the bombers, now even the hunters carry bombs." The transformation reshaped the battlefield itself. In earlier years, ground troops often fought their battles largely independent of the skies above. Now, every movement, every retreat, every supply run had to calculate the possibility of sudden air attack. German soldiers began to whisper the J-bow, short for Jag bomber, fighter bomber, as if it were a curse word. To them, the P-47 had become the embodiment of that terror. Roads choked with retreating columns became graveyards of burned trucks and shattered wagons. Horses bolted from fire, leaving artillery abandoned in fields. German commanders spoke of flying artillery with resignation, knowing that their once-vaunted air force could no longer shield them. By late 1944, the psychological toll was unmistakable. Even when no Thunderbolts were in the sky, the fear of them was. German units reported halting movements at the mere sound of distant engines, unsure if the roar belonged to friends or enemies. One captured soldier admitted under interrogation, "We fear the Jugs more than the bombers. The bombers you can see from miles away. The Jugs come suddenly, like lightning." The irony extended all the way to German high command. Reports filtering back to Berlin painted a picture so absurd it bordered on humiliation. Fighters, those nimble machines meant for aerial duels, were now carrying bomb loads half the size of the Flying Fortress, and they were delivering them with a speed and precision that the Luftwaffe could not match. A general wrote in exasperation, "The Americans have made every plane into a bomber. How does one defend against such madness?" Yet for all the destruction, there were moments of dark humor even on the Allied side. Pilots teased each other about overloading their fat Jug. One told a mechanic, "If you strap any more on her, I'll need landing gear from a Sherman tank." Another joke that his aircraft was half beer mug, half battleship. These small sparks of levity punctuated the grim work of tearing apart an enemy's lifelines. And then came the Ardennes, December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched their last great offensive through the snowy forest, hoping to split the Allies and force a negotiated peace. For a few days, the weather grounded Allied air power, and German armor surged forward with frightening speed. But when the skies cleared, the Thunderbolts returned with vengeance. Columns of German tanks that had pushed deep into Allied lines were caught on icy roads and annihilated from the air. Survivors would later call those frozen paths death roads, marked by the charred husks of panzers, half-tracks, and trucks stretching for miles. In that moment, the transformation of the P-47 was complete. It was no longer simply a fighter, nor merely a bomber. It was a force of nature. By the time 1945 dawned, the numbers told a story the Luftwaffe could hardly comprehend. P-47 Thunderbolts, once dismissed as heavy and clumsy, had destroyed more German vehicles and locomotives than entire fleets of heavy bombers. They had strangled supply lines, hammered fortifications, and reduced the mighty German army to a shadow of itself. And they had done it all while flying low, alone, sometimes just one man against a column of tanks. What makes it almost poetic is the contrast. The B-17 was designed at the start to be a flying fortress, grand, imposing, bristling with guns. The P-47, by contrast, was never meant to be a bomber at all. It stumbled into that role through necessity, ingenuity, and sheer toughness. In the end, it became something stranger, a flying fortress condensed into a single seat wrapped in steel, propelled by one of the most powerful piston engines ever built. The German Air Force, once the terror of Europe, never imagined it would face such a foe. To them, the Jug was a joke, a barrel in the sky. Yet by the end of the war, it was a Jug that had shattered their convoys, silenced their trains, and broken their armies back. And as the last Luftwaffe units fell silent, the irony remained sharp. It was not only the glamorous bombers or the sleek fighters that defined victory, but the underestimated workhorse, the flying sledgehammer, the fat little Jug that poured fire upon an empire until it collapsed.